All right. So my name's Carl von Bulow. I'm a developer on Vidal's team, uh, leading the responsive header development. And this is going to be pretty technical talk, mostly about code, and going to go over React and Redux, and then the very different variations you can have with ES5, 6, and 7 using those. And uh, So for the header, we're using ES7 features, and we're able to do that thanks to the transpiler called Babel. It's kind of become the standard uh, transpilation engine for JavaScript these days. So we're using that in conjunction with Webpack to process everything. So yeah, uh, you can contact me on Slack or Twitter at cvbulow. And yeah, so let's just dive right in. Start by looking at React class written in ES5, and and then kind of go through the variations of that in ES6 and 7. So the way you create it in ES5 is using this React.create class, and then
If you can zoom in any, Carl.
zoom in.
Yeah, you make it a little larger.
Is that better?
Thank you.
So yeah, so this is creating a class, and we just pass in this object literal into this create class method, and it has these different properties that React knows about that are specific to React. This one is like a lifecycle method for React. It'll execute this whenever the component is mounted. So if you need to do some initial stuff, for the first time it's mounted, you use that. And this is just defining property types that the component uses, and then those default properties for those property types. So we've got size and is fixed size. And then some initial state. So components can have their own state. And right here we're just defining that it's got a menu open property of false. And then the render function, the most important part of the component, this returns what's called JSX. Now it looks like inline HTML, but so React actually transpiles this into an object, a JavaScript object that's then interpreted by the regular JavaScript engine. So this just makes it easier to work on your template in React, and it's kind of combines the template with the JavaScript so they're closer to each other, and it's easier to bind things into it. But it's basically creating a virtual representation of what the DOM will be. So this looks like DOM markup, but it's going to be converted into a regular JavaScript object, and then that will be again that's called like the virtual DOM, and then that's used to generate the actual DOM. So anyway, that's I don't want to talk too much about the technicalities of React. Hopefully, a lot of you are familiar with it already. But yeah, so there's this button in this template. You click, and it's firing this function. And then we're using the state to kind of toggle the visibility of this element here. So this is just kind of a stripped down version of what we're doing. It's more like pseudocode just for this presentation. So yeah, that's the ES5 version. Now let's look at what it looks like in ES6. So in ES6, we have imports. So we can import a JavaScript module in this way, and we can also import other packages. So a module can have various exports. It can have like a default export, which in this case is React, and then it can have other exports, which are React component and prop types. So then we can take advantage of the class, in the ES6 class, to define our header component, and then we just extend the React component. So this is kind of shorthand. I could have also written this as React.component, but this is, and not imported this separately. But this is a little cleaner, and yeah, it just looks better. So then the first difference is our constructor replaces, if we switch back to here, ES5, component will mount, this lifecycle method is replaced with a constructor. So now this line is in there, and we're setting up our state in the constructor. Now we have to call the super constructor as well. So this calls the constructor of component. This is just how we have to do it in ES6. And yeah, so then moving on down, stuff stayed the same. And now we brought out the prop types, and default props are now being defined onto this header class. Whereas before, they were just in here as part of the object literal, and there is called get default props and get initial state. Whereas now it's just called prop types and default props, which is a little shorter, nicer. You don't have to return anything. And then we're exporting the header class. So yeah, so it's looking better. It's a little nicer on the eyes. But now when we take advantage of some ES7 features, we can make some more improvements. So again, this is the same class. Now with ES7, we can create these static properties here for the prop types and the default props, so that they're inside the class, which is better for readability, and yeah, everything's just more contained. It's easier to see, everything that belongs to this class, instead of having those defined out here at the bottom. And then the state, we can just define inline here as another property, and so the constructor doesn't have as much in it anymore. And one thing I should mention, you don't need to have a constructor. So for example, if we didn't have that functionality right there of getting the account, if we didn't have anything to do, there's no need to just have an empty constructor like this. We could just remove that entirely and clean it up even more. So that's just, yeah, side note. Now for this toggle menu, this is something specific to ES7. What we're doing here, let me go back to ES6 first real quick. So you see in the code, when we call this, we pass it as a callback to the onClick handler, and we have to bind to this, which is the reference to the class, so that when it's executed, it still has the correct context. Now, we could have gotten around this by pre-binding in our constructor. We could have said this toggle menu equals this toggle menu bind this, and then it would always be bound, and we wouldn't have to do it again down here. But this can get kind of messy if you have a lot of methods. Doing that for each one, it's yeah, not very pretty. But at the same time, we don't want to always have to be binding the context to our methods. So ES7 to the rescue. Thanks to static property initializers, is what these are called. So we're initializing a static property here, but we're doing it as an arrow function, which arrow functions are another ES6 property that are bound to the context that they're defined in. So so now in our code, when we call this, we don't have to bind anymore explicitly. We can just reference that directly. No binding, nice and pretty. Yeah, so that's that. Now, I want to talk about Redux next. So Redux, those of you who don't know it, it stands for reducers plus flux, and flux is kind of a state management / data flow model that Facebook came up with, and it's unidirectional data flow. Just makes things easier to keep track of. And anyway, so Redux is kind of a variation of that, and it uses what are called reducers to manipulate the state. So how the flow works is you start off with an action. An action gets triggered either by user interaction or page load or something. So that is then intercepted by some middleware in Redux, and you can define your own middleware. Or just you don't have to use any middleware if you don't want to, but to do most things you need middleware. For example, for asynchronous operations where you're doing a request to the server to get some data, so the middleware will take care of that. It'll kind of think of it as pausing the action or stopping the action, and then doing some calculations, getting some data from the server, and then when that comes back, it can trigger a new action, which in turn can go to the middleware again, and it can keep going in that loop if it wants to, but eventually it'll stop and won't trigger any more actions, and then Redux will pass off this action to the reducer, and the reducer will then calculate a new state tree for the application, and then return that to the renderer, which in our case is React. You don't have to use React with Redux, but it's usually works better that way. And then the renderer will re-render the page with the new state and give you the updated view, and then you can from there trigger another action and just keep going through that flow. So that's kind of Redux in a nutshell, I guess. Now, the way there are different ways you can structure your code for a Redux project. Some people like to keep the actions in their own folder and the reducers in another folder, and then have components and containers. So for our the way we decided to do it was to have the folder structure kind of mimic the state of the application. So when I say state, it's basically this one large object that manages the state. So everything is contained in there. In Redux terminology, it's called a store. So the store has all everything, all the state of your application inside it. So if you had a shopping cart, it'd have all that information, your account information. You can have UI information in there, like the state of the UI or the page you're on. So you see this follows kind of this like hierarchical structure. So the way we did it in our code, we have a folder called store, which just mimics this structure. So we have a folder for account that manages this part of the state, and then we have a folder for cart, which manages this part of it, and so on for UI, etc. So this makes it easier to kind of reason about the store and just see, like, just keep things organized. And then, so we could go deeper, like if in account we wanted to have another level, we could go deeper and deeper in here and just have each level manage its own part of the state tree. And then everything eventually gets combined in the reducer. We just import all those pieces of the state and combine it using this Redux combine reducers method. And yeah, so this is ES6 syntax. It's kind of a shorthand for defining the properties. I think it's called object literal property value shorthand, but nobody really calls it that. So this is just shorthand for saying defining an object like this. So if you have a variable with the same name as the key that you want, then you can just do shorthand like this. Yeah, let's leave that. So anyway, this is how we structure the store part of it, and then this exports the store itself, which is then used by Redux to bind that to your application. So we also have a folder for middleware where we define middleware that we have, and then we split our components up into two categories. We have what we call containers that are smart components, so they're aware of Redux and the state of the application. And then we have dumb components that are not aware of the state, and they just have properties that you can change, and they receive all their information through their properties. So let's just look now at a reducer to kind of see what that looks like. So the reducer will take in some initial state, and again here we're using an ES6 feature. It's default function arguments to define that, and so if state is not defined, then this is like the initial starting point for the state that it'll use. And the reducer receives an action, and then it has to return a new state object. So it can't just manipulate the state object that it receives. It has to actually create a new one and return that. Because state has to be immutable in order for this to work. It makes it easier to reason about the state, and it also helps us with Redux dev tools, and yeah, it's just easier to track down bugs that way. So in ES6 we can do it this way. With object assign, we create a new object and merge in everything from this other object, and yes, okay, so these are two different examples. Yeah, let's just focus on this one right now, the UI toggle. So this is just creating a new object with all the properties from state, and then adding this new property which will override the one that's in state, and returning that. Now this is a more complicated example where we actually want to add a new key. and so we have to do 2 object assigns to get the desired state that we want. Now if we do this in sorry. So if we do this in ES7, where'd they go? We can make some simplifications using the taking advantage of the object spread syntax. So if we use this notation here, this will automatically spread out all the properties into this new object, and we don't have to use object assign as we were doing before. So this, let's focus on this piece here, comparing these two. So this is using object assign, and then the state, and passing in the new object. And this is just using the spread syntax to spread those properties into this new object literal that's being created. So those are just some things you can do to make it cleaner. This is kind of a side note, I guess. Actions, this is like what an action would look like. It's pretty simple. You just return a function that returns an object, and I mean, it can take arguments if you needed to, but yeah. So now how do we hook this up to our React component? So first we have to import this connect method from the React Redux package. And then once we have initialized our class, here at the bottom when we export it, we wrap the header class in this method. So we call it first with these 2 params and then pass in the header. So what these are, this is mapping the state to the properties for the class, and then also the actions have to be mapped with the they have to be, whenever we execute an action, we have to wrap it in dispatch in order for React to know about it and to handle that action. So this will is just doing that wrapping for you. So this toggle menu, we imported here at the top, and then we're wrapping it with dispatch. Now it's a little messy doing it this way. It's not very pretty looking. So if we use ES7, we can clean this up a little bit using ES7 decorator. So now we use connect in this way, where it's just decorating this class header. So by defining it here in front of it, it knows to decorate this class, and then we can just pass in an arrow function for mapping the state to our properties, and then just an object literal with the actions that we want wrapped in dispatch. And these will then also be mapped to our properties in the component. So this is basically all you have to do to hook up Redux to this component is adding this in. And then in our component, when we call toggle menu. So when we call toggle menu, it'll be on props instead of being defined on the class itself. And then when we read the state, that'll also be on props since that's being mapped to it up here. So that's Redux in React kind of very quickly. Now I wanted to show kind of running out of time, but I wanted to show just the live reloading dev features of React and Redux. So let me just pull this open real quick here. So the nice thing about the dev tools that Redux has is that you can live reload your page without destroying the state. So you can make changes to your state. For example, here I'm going to open the menu, and now that's that's saved in the state. If I refresh the page, it's going to go back to close menu. Now, if I'm developing and I'm working on this part, I don't want to be keep reloading the page and every time I make a change. So here, if I make a change in the code and save that, then it automatically refreshes over here without doing a full page reload. It just does it's called a hot module replacement, and it just replaces that part of the code that was changed, and it keeps the state that we had. So the menu's still open. It maintained that page state. I don't have to like go back and recreate all the steps to get to a certain place in the application to see if my change was made. And so that's pretty useful. I mean, this works with. So this was a JavaScript file I was changing. We could change CSS or stylus file. If I made a change here and saved, it would reload that on the fly. And yeah, so it's just a nice nice tool for speeding up the development workflow. And so this is all thanks to Webpack. Webpack is the one doing the hot module replacement, and this is like a Webpack config file. I don't really want to have time to go over it, but yeah, so Webpack, you basically give it a starting point in your application, and which would for us is like the index file, and then it'll just look at all the import statements and figure out which code it needs to bring in, and then it'll do the transpilation using Babel and any other things you want it to do. We have linting, and or for CSS files, like we use stylus, so it'll convert the stylus to actual CSS and can do all these transformations on the code, and then spit it out to the server. So yeah, that's kind of all we have time for. Are there any questions about this? Nope, no questions. Okay, well, like I said, you can. My name is Carl von Bulow. You can, if you have any questions, you can contact me on Slack, CVBulow, or on Twitter. The same. And yeah, thanks for watching. Have a good rest of your day.